Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Todd. I'm a reference librarian here at Chelmsford Public Library, and we are so excited to welcome Cindy Wilson for this evening's presentation. Cindy Wilson is the author of The Beautiful Snow, The Ingalls Family, The Railroads, and the Hard Winter of 1880 and 81, which was awarded gold in the category of Midwest Best Regional Nonfiction for the 2021 Independent Publisher Awards, the IPPEs. It was also a 2020 finalist for the National Indie Excellence Awards. In the early research stage for The Beautiful Snow, Cindy read the diaries of surveyor Charles Wood Irish. She found them fascinating, knowing they held a fantastic story, and the result of that is we suffered much. Cindy is a sought-after speaker, having given talks to groups as large as 200 people, including the most viewed talk of 2022 for the Herbert Hoover Presidential Library. An article about photography and art depicting the hard winter was published in South Dakota History, Volume 53, Number 4. She is listed among the credits of PBS American Masters Laura Ingalls Wilder Prairie to Page for assisting the staff with the history of the hard winter and finding related locations for filming. Her research was cited in Pioneer Girl, the revised texts, as well as Rose Wilder Lane on Railroads and the Winter of 1881, South Dakota History, Volume 51, Number 3. Well, I've done enough to talking you up. I'm going to let you take it from here. Welcome, Cindy. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. And I'm going to share my screen now and get that going. Can everybody see that? So thank you for being here tonight. I'm going to be talking tonight about the history behind the hard winter of 1880-81, focused on the railroad's efforts to keep the tracks clear, mixed with a bit of how that winter was depicted by Laura Ingalls Wilder in her novel, The Long Winter, one of the Little House books. That winter is known for being one of endless blizzards and hunger and cold, and where brand new towns in western Minnesota and eastern Dakota Territory were left in isolation because the trains couldn't get through, and the trains couldn't get west because snow blocked areas along the tracks called cuts. We're going to look at the Tracy Cut, which played a big role in the novel, and through the Tracy Cut, we can understand what was going on across the wider region. The Hard Winter's been kept alive by Wilder's novel, which was published in 1940. And the novel is set in the town of De Smet, but all of the towns west of those railroad blockades were having similar problems for the same reason. So as we go along, while all every now and then say De Smet, remember that there were a lot of other towns having the exact same problem. And in the novel, there was an early blizzard in mid-October. By late November, there were near constant blizzards and rarely more than 1 or 2 days between storms. The town was brand new. The merchants hadn't yet laid in a heavy stock of goods because they assumed that the trains would be running and they'd be able to resupply as they needed. They were putting their capital into setting up their business, building their houses, etc. And so we're not putting that money into big stocks of merchandise yet. Trains became infrequent and then stopped altogether by mid-January. Food and fuel began to run low. The railroad company was definitely painted as the enemy. Hay was twisted and burned for heat, and the people grew increasingly cold and hungry. The last storm was in April, and the trains didn't return until early May. And the deprivations suffered due to that lack of trains is what inspired Wilder to write The Long Winter as a part of the Little House series. And in the novel, the inability of those trains to get west was blamed on the big cut west of Tracy. So we're going to look at maps and photos of that cut. I'm going to establish that the weather was indeed absolutely terrible. And then we're going to look at how the railroads handled all that snow according to the newspaper record and photographs taken at the end of the hard winter. And then we'll look a little bit at how the railroads handled the situation going forward. So now that we have some context on that winter as it's known through its most famous voice, we're going to go back to the newspaper record or the historic record, but I'm going to start by talking about the railroad system that impacted DeSmet. And there were two major rail lines involved, both connected to the Chicago and Northwestern. And the Winona and St. Peter was the more established railroad, and it started at Winona on the Mississippi River and went west to the Watertown area in eastern Dakota Territory before construction was stopped by the Panic of 1873. The Dakota Central, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, started at Tracy and went west. And the fact that the Dakota Central extended off of the Winona and St. Peter is going to be a big part of the problem during the hard winter, because what was going on the Dakota Central was completely dependent on the track situation along the Winona and St. Peter. Again, the Dakota Central started in Tracy and went west to the Missouri River, and DeSmet was about 100 miles to the west of Tracy. This rail line began construction in 1879, and for readers of the Little House books, this is the railroad that Charles Ingalls worked for and brought the Ingalls family west out of Minnesota and into Dakota Territory to look for a homestead, which is the plot of the novel By the Shores of Silver Lake. And that big cut west of Tracy was just barely west of Tracy. This map is from 1916, but it shows the two cuts, which are just to the west of Tracy. The first one straddles sections 28 and 27, and it looks like this. I'd said that the trains couldn't get through because of the cuts. And simply a cut is where a hill existed, but the railroad wanted to go straight through that hill, not up and over. So the crew simply cut out a path through the hill that the tracks could go through. And during construction, the goal was to go as far west as fast as possible. So usually these cuts were barely wide enough to allow a train to go through. And that was wonderful for the construction. It was absolutely terrible for ongoing operations, because the more narrow the cut, the more likely it was to trap snow. Blowing snow would get into the cut, but then it couldn't get out. It would just swirl around and eventually settle and then compress into this ice and dirt mixture that by the end of the winter would be several feet thick on top of some of these rails. As constructed, this particular cut was about 500 feet long and about 5 feet deep. So it was a good candidate for the Tracy cut. But if we go back to that map, there is a much larger or longer cut to the west, and that is our Tracy cut. And as constructed, it was about 5 times as long as the one I just showed you and at least twice as deep. Another way to show the concept of these cuts is to look at this particular profile map, which shows the cut and the land leading up to it. That straight and steady line is the grade of the tracks. And where the line undulates above the grade line, that is where they had to cut through a hill. And the resulting cut looks like this. And then just to balance that, where the line went under it, that's where they had to fill in dirt, and the resulting fill looks like this. So now we're going to fly through the cut. The drone was flying at about 15 miles an hour, which is about the speed that a train would have traveled in 1880, but there wouldn't have been these kind of bushes and trees at the time. And while we fly through the cut, I'm going to read a passage out of The Long Winter that kind of sets the stage for what the cuts represented in terms of problem. "Everything's all right in town," Pa said, "and word from the depot is that they'll be starting work tomorrow morning on that big cut this side of Tracy." "How long will it take to get a train through?" Laura asked. "Can't tell," Pa replied. "That one clear day we had, they cleaned it out. ready to come through next day. But they shoveled the snow up both sides of the cut, and now it's packed full, clear to the top of the banks, something like 30 feet deep of snow, frozen solid. They've got to dig out now. The physical characteristics of a cut were almost designed to trap snow, and there were a lot of cuts along the tracks in this region. For instance, this is just a short sample of the Dakota Central somewhere to the east of Brookings. Again, the red line is the grade of the tracks, and the red arrows show where a cut had to be made to go through a hill, and each one of those cuts would have filled with snow over and over throughout the winter and would have needed attention. And again, the blue arrows just show where they had to fill. And yes, they tended to use the fill from, or the dirt they took out of the hill to make the cut to fill in the dirt where they needed it. And for reference, each of the bold horizontal lines on this particular map represents just 5 feet of elevation. So these weren't giant hills, there were just a lot of them. So now we're going to set the mood and take a look at the weather. The first blizzard struck in mid-October of 1880. Wednesday's rain turned to snow Thursday night, and on Friday night, the wind, which had hitherto been quiet, commenced blowing a gale. The storm continued to slowly get better until Sunday afternoon. And we're lucky because a photographer went out after that October storm and took some pictures. This photo was taken at the rail yard in St. James, Minnesota, which was about 150 miles to the east and a little bit south of De Smet, not far from Walnut Grove. And if you look, you can see that the snow has drifted up against and under and between those box cars. And if you look really closely, you can see that the doors on the cars had been left open, so snow drifted into those cars too. Now, according to newspaper articles, the weather did improve following this storm, and in fact, most of November was mild enough that prairie fires became a problem. And much of the snow that fell from various events up until Christmas had melted away. But on December 26, one of the winter's biggest storms hit and pretty much set off the beginning of the end for the trains. I'm going to read a couple of newspaper quotes from the winter that pretty much sets the stage for what the railroads were going to have to deal with. Sunday was a terror. It snowed and it blowed and it drifted until it seemed as though the whole country was to be inundated. January 21st and 22nd were noted as 2 of the most trying days we have had this winter. For 2 days, the wind blew a perfect gale from the northwest, piling snow up in all sorts of shapes. Just a week later, on January 31st, there was a delightful breeze and only about 3 feet more snow. Hang on just a moment. The worst snowstorm in the recollection of the oldest settlers struck this city and vicinity about 11 o'clock last Friday morning, and it raged with almost unabated fury until late Sunday night. March was no better, and the last storm of the winter was in mid-April. According to records kept at Fort Snelling, the snowfall this winter has been 4 times as great as for the previous 9 years, and 9 times the average of 19 years. So winter was finally over, but the railroads were still having to deal with the cuts that were clogged with snow and ice. And the novel does a good job of addressing the impact that the winter had had on the cuts along the various rail lines, hindering the opening of the railroads even after the storms had stopped. The blizzard winds had blown earth from the fields where the sod was broken and had mixed it with snow packed in so tightly in the railroad cuts that snowplows could not move it. The icy snow could not melt because of the earth mixed with it, and men with picks were digging it out inch by inch. It was slow work because in many big cuts, they must dig down 20 feet to the steel rails. So while April brought the promise of spring, the trains were still close to a month away for the people west of the blockades. And I would imagine this was one of the more difficult times of the whole winter psychologically. Now that we've seen how the weather unfolded, let's turn back to that October storm and see how the railroads fared. The combination of the snow and the winds and the narrow cuts meant that the railroad companies had a Herculean task ahead of them to try and keep the snow off of the rails. That October storm had ended on Sunday the 17th. The first train made it to Tracy on Tuesday the 19th. A train made it to Marshall on October 23rd, and a train reached Watertown after 9 days on Tuesday the 26th. But in a bit of foreboding, as of that same October 26th, a full week and a half after the storm started, crews were still working to clear snow from the Dakota Central in the area of Lake Benton, not even halfway between Tracy and DeSmet. Now, during November's mild weather, people went back to their regular lives, as we tend to do, and the newspapers reassured their readers that the railroad companies had several snowplows at the ready and were well prepared for the winter. We have taken a view of that mammoth snowplow which is lying at the depot. It is a big one, and none need fear of being deluged by snowstorms. From appearances, we should think that the monster might go through a mountain of snow, let alone a 16-foot drift. This is that plow described as mammoth in the previous quote. And the photo shows it sitting in front of 3 locomotives, which is how it was described in the newspaper accounts as well. That was just part of how it operated. But if you look closely, you'll probably already have noticed its fatal flaw. It's made out of wood, and so you've probably guessed its fate. Hurling a wooden plow pushed by 3 powerful steam locomotives is pretty much a recipe for disaster. And in fact, in February, this plow hit a big drift just a little too hard. And according to the newspapers, it was described as having shattered into slivers. Now, normal operating procedure was to simply keep the trains rolling over the tracks frequently enough to prevent snow from piling up. But over such a large region, that was not a practical solution. So when snow did drift over the tracks, snow bucking was the process used. And essentially, they would run a locomotive or 2 or 3, sometimes with a plow, sometimes without, full speed ahead into a drift and hope that they would break through it. And the process was supplemented by shovelers who would break up the snow before they rammed the drift and would help shovel it away afterwards. Sometimes this worked the first time, sometimes it required multiple attempts, and sometimes they had to dig those locomotives out of a snowbank. So let's pause here to visit an episode from The Long Winter. A pivotal scene occurs when the superintendent from the east comes out to the Tracy Cut to try to clear a snow blockade. The train engineer refused to do the dangerous job of ramming that snowbank, so the superintendent himself took the helm. They backed up the engines and plow and went full speed ahead to slam into the snowbank. But instead of breaking through, the locomotives lodged into the drift. And due to the heat of the engine, the snow melted and then froze into ice, and they had to extricate the superintendent from the cab. That night, another snowstorm came through and undid all of the work that the crew had done the day before. Discouraged, the superintendent declared that the railroad would not try to keep the tracks clear for the rest of the winter. So in the novel, all of the towns west of the Tracy Cut were left abandoned until spring. A February newspaper article was found that is strongly reminiscent of the superintendent's story from the long winter, and a dramatic portion of that article reads as follows. The engines went back for a distance of 1.5 miles to gain a greater degree of velocity. The engineers and firemen stood at their posts, firm and fast. Full head of steam had been attained, and the powerful engines fairly trembled to exhaust their strength. The word was given, and the engines were thrown wide open and came rushing along the track at a rate of speed which sent the sparks flying from the flanges and shot clouds of flame from the smokestacks. As the gigantic plow was driven with frightful and resistless force into the wall of snow, the effect upon the spectator was such as can be experienced under no other circumstances. Balls of snow weighing 1,000 pounds were sent from the chute of the great iron plow. There's a lot of similarities to that article compared to the superintendent's story. And the article was published in an Eastern Dakota Territory newspaper, and it would have been read by regional residents. However, the event itself took place upon the Kansas Pacific near Cheyenne Wells in eastern Colorado. It was originally published in the Denver Tribune and then picked up by other newspapers around the region. But the superintendent's story is essentially about snowbucking, something that took place just about every day of the entire winter. And we have a photo of what it looked like as a locomotive blew through one of these giant drifts of snow. The photo's from 1917, but the impact would have been the same. I would love to know what this would have sounded like, and I would have been standing a lot farther away than those shovelers were based on that other description about those 1,000-pound chunks of snow that are blown around when this happens. So while snowplows and locomotives were the big equipment, the more common tool was simply a man with a shovel. And they were engaged both paid and volunteer by the thousands throughout the winter. And if you look at this photo in the upper right corner, you can see that the surrounding prairie at this point has relatively little snow on it compared to what is built up around the cut. And this photo was taken, I think this is an early April 1881 photo at the end of the hard winter. Another interesting thing about this particular photo is in the lower left corner, you can see a portion of the photographer's shadow. So now that we've seen the tools used to keep the tracks clear, let's look at the reality of the cuts and where the real problems were from the perspective of getting goods from the east out to the towns to the west. It seems to be an impossibility to keep the road open between Sleepy Eye and Tracy. They no sooner get a train through when along comes another blizzard and fills up the cuts again. The railroad company are doing all any human power can do to keep the road clear. And that quote pretty much summed up the entire winter. This map shows the larger region and the railroad lines that infiltrated it. And with the exception of the Winona and St. Peter, which had been in place as of 1873, most of the towns to the west of Tracy were built in 1879 and 1880, meaning that most of them were less than a year old, and a good percentage of them were less than 6 months old when that October storm hit. And these brand new towns were especially dependent on the trains coming through so that they could get food and fuel. And the gray areas on this map show where along each of those lines, a cut or a series of cuts effectively blocked the trains. Now, there were hundreds of cuts across the wider region. These were simply the catastrophic ones. And by mid-January, the area impacted by the little gray spots here looked like this. Now, according to the newspaper record, unless a blizzard was actively raging, there were gangs of workers, whether railroad employees or general citizens, whether they were paid or volunteer, constantly at work. So we're going to look now at a handful of photos taken in late March and early April of 1881 to put some visual context into what the railroads and the residents were contending with. This particular cut is so narrow that you can see grooves carved into the side of the snowbank by the handles, whether it be the ladder rungs or door handles, as the car could pass through. And this particular cut was just to the west of Sleepy Eye. Now, it's a very neat and clean and tidy cut, and most of them did not look this cleaned up. A heavy windstorm last Saturday sifted snow into the cuts between New Ulm and Sleepy Eye. The road was opened on Sunday, but the cuts were again filled up during the night, and it took all day Monday and part of Tuesday to clear the track. No trouble's been experienced operating the trains east of here. An interesting part of that quote is that no trouble's been experienced east of here portion. This particular photo was taken just west of St. Peter, which is about 25 miles to the east of New Ulm, where that article appeared. So while the tracks are open, they certainly look a little bit precarious, but this is what the open tracks east of New Ulm looked like. And here's another photo just showing how deep and narrow some of these cuts were as they were clearing them out. Now, as the snow piled up, the shovelers had to create tiers to get the snow up and away from the tracks. The men at the bottom would shovel the snow up as high as they could reach. Then men at that level would shovel it up as high as they could reach, and then so on until somebody could finally shovel that snow away from the tracks. And I've seen photos of 4 and 5 tiers. Now, one of the more interesting things to me at this point about this photo is something that I didn't even notice until I'd been working with it for about a year. But if you look at the men down at track level and then let your eye drift back to the horizon, there are shovelers as far back as you can see. This photo was taken on April 15th, and it shows how the snow would be segmented into blocks. Then they would remove some of the extra weight from the block. That's what the man up on top is doing. And then they would wrap cables around that block, hook it to the front of a locomotive, and then it would be backed out of the cut. And look at how tall those blocks of snow are compared to the men that are standing beside them. And this photo was taken at a different location, but it does show what one of these blocks of snow looked like after it had been backed out of the cut. And again, the surrounding prairie has relatively little snow compared to what's compacted within the cut. This photo was taken on March 29th, so there was still at least one more storm during the winter after this photo was taken. And this is what it looked like just west of Sleepy Eye most of the winter, and thus is the true culprit of the deprivation suffered in De Smet and the other towns to the west. Trains couldn't get far enough west to be hindered by the Tracy Cut because the trains really were blocked about 50 more miles to the east near Sleepy Eye. Now, there is evidence in the newspaper record that efforts to keep the Dakota Central open were halted midwinter because until trains could get to Tracy, there was not a lot of incentive to pour the energy and the funds into working on the Dakota Central. So instead, the manpower and the money were invested in trying to get the Winona and St. Peter open from Sleepy Eye to Tracy. But still, the winter just kept lingering on. The last storm didn't end until April 12th. Most of the snow did melt except in those cuts where it had to be loosened with picks. And as the weather warmed, flooding and track washouts became a new problem, and those repairs had to be made as well. This particular article appeared after the last April blizzard. 800 men are now engaged in opening the Winona and St. Peter Railroad west of Sleepy Eye. At latest accounts, only a few miles had been cleared. Ice 2 feet in thickness on top of the rails is found in places. No snowplow could buck such a drift. Warm weather alone is likely to take out such ice banks. Track washouts and weary workers who would leave the job to go and tend to their own responsibilities both delayed the return of the trains. And this was particularly true of farmers who, as spring arrived, needed to get back into their own fields. The snow shovelers are getting tired of their work and caused the railroad managers considerable vexation. Also, due to the lack of fuel because the trains hadn't been running, many of the snow fences and bridges and trestles and ties had been pulled up by residents over the winter and burned for heat. And those repairs also had to be made before the trains could safely run. This map shows when, according to the newspaper record, trains returned to the towns. And the date in parentheses after a town name shows the last time I was able to confirm a train had arrived in the town. And counterintuitively, the northernmost town got the first train because the storms were much worse in the southern part of the region. So what impacts did the hard winter have on railroad operations going forward? In the coming years and even decades, the railroad companies invested time and effort at the worst of these cuts. Many of them were widened because, again, the wider the cut, the less likely it was to trap snow. This drone photo shows trees planted alongside the Tracy Cut to protect it from the predominantly northwest winter winds. And those trees had been planted sometime before 1938 because those trees are visible in this photo from that year. So these measures definitely help, but there are photographs well into the 20th century showing trains stuck along the tracks in this particular area. This is another map of the Tracy Cut, which is the part there in yellow. And if you note that the Tracy Cut extends beyond that township line to just before the curve in the track. So remember that curve. Today, that township line is a dirt road and thus allows us a benchmark spot that we can look at. Today, the Tracy Cut stops to the east of that township line, well before the curve. And in the photo, we can see the scars of what was once a part of the Tracy Cut. The original Tracy Cut was about 39% longer than it is now. It's lost about 1,100 of its original feet. So we can see that in the decades after the hard winter, considerable effort was put into trying to lessen or even eliminate the problems that had led to suffering for families like the Ingalls. However, there's only so much we can do against the weather, as we know. And this happened in February of 2019 in southern Minnesota. And remember that trains are taller now than they were in 1880. For location, This is a map of southern Minnesota. So that gray line at the bottom is the border between Minnesota and Iowa. And this train was stuck along the tracks for about 12 hours in about at the end of the arrow there. They had food and heat and water on board, but did have to be rescued by the National Guard. But February of 2019 is almost 6 years ago. This happened just over 2 years ago in southern South Dakota, not all that far from De Smet, if we look at the map there. So we can see that even today, with our stronger and more modern equipment, we can still only do so much when it snows. So throughout the newspaper record of that winter, there were frequent mentions of the phrase, the beautiful snow. Editors mentioned at time that there wasn't enough of the beautiful to make for good sleighing, or that there were piles upon piles of the beautiful blocking the wagon roads, or that a nice consequence of the delayed mails was that the editors didn't have to read poetry sent in by people about the beautiful. In 1871, there had been a book of poetry published that had made its way into the general culture, and the title poem was The Beautiful Snow. And its first verse reads like this: "Oh, the snow, the beautiful snow, filling the sky and the earth below, over the housetops, over the street, over the heads of the people you meet." Among the many mentions of the beautiful snow within the newspaper, one of them led to the title of my book. And it was this version of the poem which appeared in a January newspaper. "Oh, the snow, the beautiful snow, filling the cuts so the trains can't go." So I've just shared a fraction of the information and the photographs that appeared in my book, but I'd be happy to take questions. And one of the things that came out of the research for the beautiful snow was my having read the diaries and personal letters of the surveyor who figured out where that railroad would go, the Dakota Central from Tracy west, and that created towns like Brookings and De Smet, Huron, and etc. And I'm going to be talking on February 20th through the library here with another Zoom. So if you haven't signed up for that one, I would love to have you there as well. And so I am now going to unshare the screen and would love to take questions. Thank you. It's this library, so Chelmsford again, on the 20th of February. So their website will have a registration link on it. Okay, the chat is scrolling fast enough. I might miss some things, but do we know how many people died during the storms? And somebody else asked, did people die from hunger? From that very first October storm, because it caught people off guard, it had been nice weather, and then all of a sudden, boom. There were several reports of people dying that winter. It wasn't a huge number, but even one person, that is a tragedy. For the rest of the winter, not very many or any more people died from the weather. Livestock, it was unbelievable numbers of livestock died over the course of the winter. There was no documented that I found of anybody dying of hunger. People in towns would realize that like nearby families were struggling, and they would get the word out, and people in town would organize. Basically, they'd go door to door, people would donate, and then somebody would go out to wherever this house was. So I found nothing at all about anybody dying. There was hunger, there was deprivation, but perhaps not on the level that we read about in the long winter, although I have no doubt that the Ingalls family themselves were struggling because economically they were simply struggling. Let's see. Was dynamite ever used to clear snow? I did not see any articles that mentioned dynamite. Um, that's not to say it didn't happen, but I don't remember seeing any of that in this area. Dynamite tended to be more available in mining areas, and there's no mines in this area, so that might explain that. Um, Okay, is there truth to the Indians' warning of the big snow every 7 years and heap big snow every 21st winter? And if so, if this a 21st winter? Um, we do not know whether a native came in to warn the people of Desmet. There's no other um record of that. However, there were articles that popped up, especially out of the Watertown, Dakota Territory newspaper, because they were on the edge of the Sisseton reservation. And there were warnings in the Watertown area. And that's all I can say about the DeSmet one. And what got me interested in this topic? It's funny because I am a warm weather person. I am happiest when it's in the 80s and a little bit of humid, and I love severe summer storms. That's my area. I howl in great unhappiness, the song of my people, when it's cold out. So the fact that I did all of this research about the hard winter is really rather ironic. But it started very simply. My neighborhood book club had been reading some pretty heavy subjected books for months on end, and my turn was coming up in October. And I thought, let's lighten the mood a little bit. We'll read a YA novel. Well, my favorite YA young adult novel is The Long Winter. So I'm going to lighten the mood with The Long Winter. I wasn't putting the pieces together well. But I realized as I started preparing for that book club meeting that these women who like to get deep into things were going to simply ask me how close was the novel to the real history. So I thought, well, okay, this should be fairly easy to do. So I started digging around, going, into county histories. And what I found, because at around from about 1895 to about 1910, that was a period of big in this out here in the Midwest. The first generation of pioneers were now starting to pass on. And so there was a big push to record the history of the pioneers before they were gone. And so I went to those county histories and realized that a lot of what they talked about about that winter was already mythologized, or it was a lot of hyperbole. We all froze to death and died, and then the next summer was good. It's like, okay, that's not. But one of them used quotes from their local newspaper to talk about that winter, and that's when the light bulb went off. I thought, oh, the newspaper record. So that's what I did. I started digging around in the newspaper record. And as I was doing research, I would share some of what I found with a couple of my friends in the Laura Ingalls Wilder world. And they started telling me, you need to write this book because we want to read this book. And that really is how it all came about, was my insatiable curiosity prodded by wanting to be able to tell my book club some answers. And that's that. So I saw a lot of white snow in your pics, but 1 or 2 months with the dirt, Laura wrote about. I assume it was based on terrain. And if that was in the Freely, yeah, it was the dirt from the newly turned fields that would get picked up by these winds. And it does. We call it snert out here. I don't know whether in Massachusetts if you get snert, but we get snert. And right after a snow, it will be beautiful. And then a few days of wind, and the drifts will be dirty and dark and ugly and snert. Do the local historical societies in those towns have diaries or personal contemporary accounts from that time? Not a lot, because one of the decisions I made very early on was I wasn't going to rely on accounts written decades later because of that whole mythologized or memory issue. I wanted to see how the winter was unfolding for the people living through it week by week at the time. So the newspapers, for all its flaws, was kind of the closest I could come. And I did not find a lot of letters. I know that if I would contact every single historical society all across the country, I'm sure there are more out there, but they're not necessarily cataloged that way, so they'd be a little harder to find. I recently read a novel based on the children's blizzard, a fluke storm that began suddenly after an unusually mild morning, and it reminded me of Laura Ingalls Wilder's description of when Manly came to her home from the schoolhouse in blizzard. Was this related? The children's blizzard or the schoolhouse blizzard was January of 1888, so several years later. And many people confuse the children's blizzard of 1888 with the whole long winter. So often people will say, oh, I know about the hard winter. I know that was a bad blizzard. Well, the hard winter was an entire winter of bad blizzards. The children's blizzard was one storm. So not related, but people often merge them into one. But a similar situation, you have nicer weather and all of a sudden a blizzard descends and you just weren't expecting it. Do you study any other books in the series? I've studied several of them. The Long Winter, of course, most, and Silver Lake, the predecessor to The Long Winter. I probably have studied the most aside from that one. Was the rest of the general region, the Minnesota, South Dakota areas, heavily impacted by the heavy storms as well? Were the regional school systems impacted? Did the kids miss a lot of schools? A lot of school. The whole, that about the eastern half of what today is South Dakota, and pretty much the southern half of Minnesota, to even with about the Minneapolis area and south. So that's a pretty wide region, several hundred miles east-west, and maybe about 120, 150 miles northwest or north to south. That is the area most impacted by the hard winter storms. And a lot of the towns kept school going. The newspapers would report couldn't do school Thursday because of the storm. But for the most part, a lot of them kept going at least until about March, when they just had to give up, mostly because they ran out of fuel and they just couldn't keep the school warm enough. There's even evidence in what we know through reminiscences from DeSmet and a newspaper account in February that the school was actually still going on, which contradicts what Wilder put in her novel. But to what extent it was going on, we don't know. It may have, they tried here and they tried there. There was school missed. If it was to the extent of what Wilder wrote, I don't think that was fully accurate, but it certainly wasn't an ongoing successful school term during the winter for most of the region. It was hit and miss. And I'm scrolling back. If I missed anybody's question further back, you could retype it or unmute, and I'd be happy to try and answer. We'll see if Todd puts that in the chat. Were the unhappy railroad workers unionized? Not that I saw, and I don't know how many of them were unhappy out here. Did the railroads know about the problem with cuts and snow from other parts of the country, for instance? Was this particular terrain and the weather patterns new to them? They were not well informed about what it was like out here, because up until a few years prior to this, the land had been off limits, so they didn't have a lot of experience. The terrain is certainly different. However, the first transcontinental went through similar landscape, but much further south, so different weather. And this was a freak winter. But with that said, the Winona and St. Peter had gotten up to the Watertown area 1873, and the next two winters were not all that different from the hard winter weather-wise, but there weren't so many people, and they weren't dependent on the trains. So the fact that the hard winter coincided, it was kind of a perfect storm with so many brand new towns, that hadn't happened before the Panic of 1873 had put a halt to railroad expansion. So this was just a perfect storm of economic enthusiasm and these new lines pushing out onto a prairie just in time for this terrible, horrible, awful winter. And then the next several were milder. And so, and it pretty much remains a record-setting winter. I think a couple of years ago, one of the local meteorologists had run through and recorded prolonged periods of cold, and that winter remained number one or two up to today in terms of prolonged cold, that kind of thing. Oh, hang on, there's thank you for all the kind things, by the way. Sorry to stray, but did you do the quilt behind you? It's beautiful. Yes, thank you very much. Those blocks are hand pieced in a kaleidoscope, and I hung it up because a girlfriend of mine who was a quilter as well and was my cheerleader while I was doing this pattern, passed away about a year and a half ago from ALS. It was like 6 months from diagnosis to when we lost her. And so I kind of have that quilt hung as my memorial to my friend. I heard vaguely that Laura Ingalls Wilder's mother wrote a lot of Laura's work without being credited. Oh, no, there's no truth at all to her mother, but I think what the rumor or what you heard is Rose, Laura's daughter. Laura's daughter Rose was a internationally known author, and she had the connections in the publishing world and the skills for storytelling, and she mentored her mother. So she was instrumental, and they were collaborators, would be the most accurate word. Having seen original manuscripts of most of the books and looked at the process, Rose was a very, very skilled editor and teacher and mentor. But a lot of you cannot look at the original handwritten manuscripts in Laura's hand and say that Rose wrote the books. It was a collaboration, and we wouldn't have them without Rose, but they are Laura's work with a very skilled editor, which that's what editors do. Um, Thank you for the kind words about the quilt as well. Why was it a long winter? What was the reason for the cold? There is a woman named Dr. Barb Bosted. If you Google Dr. Barb, the long winter or hard winter, you will find her PhD dissertation, and it will tell you the meteorological reasons why that winter was the way it was. But if you hang on for a few more months and are very interested, she has a book coming out that's going to be called Wilder Weather. It's going to be published by the South Dakota Historical Society Press, and it will follow the various weather mentions across all of the Little House books. And so she will be talking about the history and the science behind the phenomena and the events that are included in the Little House books. So please do look for that. Snert, the dirt and snow word is snert. So SN from snow and IRT for dirt, snert. Yes, I stop at Volga every time I go out to De Smet. It's a good stopping point. Some of the maps said courtesy of Iowa State University. Nope. Oh, thank you. I will double check that because they make sure that I say Iowa City because people think that they mean Ames. I will double check and make sure I've got that correct. Thank you. That would be embarrassing. I spent a lot of time down in Iowa City. All right. Thank you, everybody. That was some really good questions. Yeah, I'm going to make a note to make sure I fix the citations. All right.
Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you, Cindy, for a great presentation.
Thank you.
I'll admit I went to University of Iowa and Iowa State for a for a brief time, and I know that I know one from the other, and it's um, very different. There are lots of little states inside of Iowa, I think.
Yes. Yep, and they were very adamant that I was very clear,
Mhm.
and I'm horrified that it appears that I messed them up, but I will fix them right away. Thank you again for the kind words, everybody. Oh, there's a couple in the Q&A too. I'm going to go to there. How was the aerial photo taken of the trees planted along the cut? It was airplane, 1938. So there were planes then. And the local county got that photo for me from their highway department, actually. What did the families do to stay alive? Basically, they rationed food to some extent. They stayed as warm as they could. Um, Wilder was writing fiction, and fiction has to have a very dramatic story arc. And so there's a combination of things. One, she was writing fiction, so heightened the story to make it very dramatic. She was 14 years old, so her memory of that winter was from a 14-year-old girl's point of view of worry and concern and fear. And so that is what she remembered. But according to what I found in newspapers and ads and that kind of thing, the food was not as short in supply as it was for the Ingalls family. And I do believe that the Ingalls family were short on food because their economics were less than a lot of people's were. But the various towns were very good about using the telegraph, especially in coordinating, okay, we're gonna send a wagon from this town to that town to bring back supplies. So there was a lot of cooperative effort going on over the course of the winter. So that's part of how the family stayed alive. And the last question, did the prices of goods skyrocket because of no new products? In some cases, but similar to what was in, there was a scene in Wilder's novel where a merchant tried to up the prices and the townspeople basically said, well, okay, it's your right, but you're going to pay the price for that. And there were editorials every now and then about, grousing about so-and-so raising their prices, and then pretty soon they were having a sale. So there was a lot of peer pressure, I guess, to not try and gouge things. Oh. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And if you're free on February 20th, I'll be doing another talk about research that came out of my new book following the surveyor who figured out where to put that railroad link. And that will, I believe the topic we picked is where the Ingalls family overlaps with the surveyor's story. And that will include a hard winter story as well. So if you're interested in that, sign up. Be great to see you again. All right. Thank you very much. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, Cindy.
All
Thank
right.
you, everyone, for joining us.
Yes, thank you.